live. Back after a bit of a break. I think this is our first episode in like 2-3 weeks. And we have
Yeah, first live one.
yeah, it's been a while. We got a great guest to get us back into the swing of things. This week we got Saneel from Ritual. Saneel, thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah, man. Really excited to be here. Also, every time I see the Exit Liquidity intro, I'm like, all right, no, all respect to other podcasts, but this is like by and far the best. I was like smiling through the whole intro.
Glad you like it,
We
man.
appreciate that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah. The inspiration for it was it took a lot of work, but it was really fun to make. Shout out Patty. She's probably watching, our editor. It's super awesome to have you on. I think this is going to be a really good one. We want to start off kind of just hearing a bit about you personally, kind of where you've been, what you've been up to.
So I'm Saneel. I do a bunch of stuff at Ritual across like go-to-market and strategy and product. But how I got to Ritual is like pretty interesting, right? Because I think everyone knows that Ritual is building in like crypto and AI, but for me, it's a really, really full circle moment. So like I knew sort of like what a blockchain was, or like I knew of what it was like back in like high school and like early college, right? But I was like really interested in the ML side, but specifically in privacy preserving ML. So like when I was a freshman, I was looking a lot into these things called like federated learning techniques and like differential privacy, right? And at some point, I was like, wow, this federated learning thing is like pretty interesting. Like, I wonder if there's a way where you can have a bunch of different models people are running and like try and combine them, right? And so I started doing like work into anyone had done that because I assumed someone had done it. And I came across like Numerai, which was like, I was like, oh, like there's this like crypto thing. And I had like heard about this before, but I didn't really know what it was. But Numerai was sort of like the first step of like, okay, we can have some on-chain incentives to get like a bunch of people running models to like converge on stuff. So that sort of like set me down the rabbit hole. I was like, oh, like this like whole ETH like Bitcoin thing's pretty interesting. Read the white paper. I was at Berkeley, so they had like the blockchain at Berkeley club, and they taught me a little bit on like how to write smart contracts and like how these things worked at a deeper level. And at this point, I was like fully gone. Like I like the ML stuff like was in the past. I was like doing like crypto proper, but I was still like So I was gonna go do or I was doing like an ML internship like after that summer. But someone had sent me a DeFi guide, and I like just fell in love with the way these things were built. I was like, wow, some of these are like really simple constructions, but they have like hundreds of millions of dollars going through, and like this is really cool. Like these things are actually being built, and everyone's saying crypto has no use case, but clearly there's a lot of money flowing. So anyway, that sent me down the rabbit hole. I got really interested in like infra, DeFi, etc. Had the good fortune of working at funds like Polychain and Dragonfly, and also being on the founding team of another company in DeFi, or at the intersection of DeFi infra, called Alchemia, which is still going. But I had always been still very interested in this idea of distributed ML and intelligence. The first report I did for Polychain in 2020 covered Numerai, BitTensor, so that was like 4 years ago, I guess now, or 3.5 years ago. Erasure Bay, which was like the bounty protocol, and then like what is now Allura, what used to be Upshot, but then before Upshot was like an NFT appraisal thing. Before Allura, it was like a whole other mechanism for like how do you get people to like agree on sort of like subjective like groupings and stuff like that. So I did it on that, and then I've been talking to Akash and Raj, with the co-founders of Ritual, who are also two out of three of the first people I ever worked with in industry at Polychain. And I think around the time FTX went under, ChatGPT came out and started going really big. And we started looking a lot into like there was already work being done in zkML, but I think like with the explosion of developers using AI, right, we'd only ever seen that level of adoption with crypto. We're like, okay, there's a lot of things where like crypto actually works and fixes stuff here. So they started Ritual, and I was fortunate enough to join early on and be there ever since.
Yeah. We'll act like we understand a lot of the terminology that you laid out there. But yeah, that's an awesome background. That's like one thing I think me and Ellie notice is like, I think a lot of people notice is the Ritual team is like stacked from experience to like just people on there. It's pretty awesome to see like the layout of the team that you have and the people kind of working together on it. You know, the part of the journey, I think, in a lot of founders and people kind of working in crypto all the time that I think is pretty interesting is that most people, developer, the Twitter guy, whoever, is trading or has like an experience trading or has their own journey. I think it tells a lot about the instances or kind of niches that people have been in. So we have a question that we run with everybody. It's the name of the podcast. Could you give us an experience that you had where you were someone
Oh,
else's
dude.
exit liquidity?
Oh, there's so many. Okay, so like there was like this site back in DeFi summer called like Harvest.finance. If you guys remember that? That just like had the most like degenerate like yields. Like it would be like these all these new like weird like ESD forks and like all these like new like bond schemes where it would just like list them and aggregate them and they would show you an UTC like 40,000% APY, right? So I was like researching crypto, right? Like I had done some like long only investments, but I hadn't like been degenerate on chain with like something really far out on the risk curve. So I was like, oh, dude, like all my friends are like just making free money. Like there's no way this goes wrong, right? So there was like something called like Honey Gold or some shit like that. That was like I was like 4,000% APY. I can withdraw in like 8 hours. Like it's gonna be great. Like nothing's gonna go wrong. So I put like a little bit of money because I was still in college and I didn't have a lot, but I put like a $800, right? And then I was like, dude, I'm gonna come back. I'm gonna be so like loaded. Like it's gonna be great. I think I left to go to the bathroom and I came back 5 minutes later and the position had already like zero because the dev rug. And that actually gave me a lot of trauma for a really, really long time. I like stuck to like doing only spot only trades, and then I was like more comfortable to go back into doing some more like on chain yield stuff and some weird arbs. But that was like right when I was getting started. That was like 3 months into me like looking into DeFi and stuff. I was like, oh dude, there's no way I lose money. So I think for like 4 months after that, I was like, dude, I'm not touching any of the stuff that's not just like buying the tokens. So that's been dumped. Luckily, no, there's been a few times where I've like invested in projects just in token and like just goes to zero, but we won't say the devs dump for those. I think sometimes things just fall out of the narrative, so I won't point fingers.
Yeah, I think I think the like being a broke college kid and just tossing money at stuff that absolutely like should not have your capital and getting burned for it's definitely like it's definitely a universal experience on this podcast. Like we've had some stuff I'm sure we'd be ashamed to admit, but it's part of the
Part of the
process. I
process. I
think
just ate ramen
it's
for
how
like the
you
next month. It's fine.
yeah, yeah, and then you do it all over again the next month.
Exactly.
It's the way it goes. Cost of tuition. So you've been around quite a bit in the space. You've been at a bunch of different organizations, and obviously now at Ritual. It sounds like you were working on ML and AI stuff from like a very like early spot. I mean, for most of us, we really didn't like think about the intersection of crypto and AI like I don't know, up until maybe like last year. I think that's when it really, really started to gain traction. From when you first started, like from when you first went like full time into crypto and you started working at these different funds, how did your focus like? What was your focus when you first started out, and how has it like shifted into what it is today?
Yeah, I'd say on the MLAI stuff, it was still very exploratory because I was young. I didn't know anything. I still probably don't know much. So it wasn't even like the deep learning stuff. It's like your classic like data science, regression, tree-based architectures, things like that. It was very, very like performative. I think for me, it was like very much coming from like a system designs level perspective, right? Like I don't claim to by any means be an MLAI expert. Hopefully I understand enough to do my job, right? But it was sort of like, okay, you have this really, really powerful tool, right, in terms of models that are really, really good at doing things like prediction right now, generation of content. And there should be, it makes sense that, data underpins this. There should be a way where you can use these tools without having to like seed your data. And I think that sort of like planted the seed. And, then you like I said, you dive down the rabbit hole of like distributed ML and then distributed systems, you get into crypto. When I got into crypto though, like I had always also really been interested in markets. Again, by no means an expert, but I just found them fascinating. And so I think the whole thing of creating basically a parallel economy on chain was super interesting. And the way that a lot of the ways these things worked were encodified, you know, in smart contracts as opposed to enshrined in some sort of contract. And you could, maybe not have the most capital efficient market, but the fact that like something like Maker could grow to the size that it did, right? Was interesting. So I really got interested in DeFi initially. I kind of was like, I don't want to like deal with the infrastructure because it's boring and I have to learn like a bunch of like random like stuff. And then like everyone in crypto, I got interested in infrastructure because I was like, oh well, like infrastructure is actually like surprise, surprise. It constrain on like what kind of applications you can build, right? And so initially it was like very much DeFi and NFTs, and I think that was very much like the thing of the wave. But I got really interested in infrastructure and specifically MEV. I thought that was like very, very fascinating to see like what essentially is like on-chain market microstructure and how that actually impacted everything from like people actually making money as like searchers to actual protocol and application design. And this was like still when Ethereum was proof of work, still when people were like thinking about launching like reorg clients, right, for Ethereum, like under Flashbots. So when I was at Dragonfly, I did a little bit of like work and looked into like reorgs, for example, in Ethereum proof of work. And from that point, I was like, okay, I'm interested in DeFi. I'm interested in infrastructure and block space and the dynamics there and how value accrues. It makes total sense that like there should be something that sort of merges the two, right? There should be some way for people to get exposure to block space directly without being like a miner or validator or something like that. So that's sort of what Alchemy started as, right? Alchemy was like, hey, like we can offer certain products, right, that allow people to get this exposure. So I found that really interesting and did that for about a year or two. But during that time, I think like there's like phases of like what's interesting, what's not. There's a bull and bear market, and I was like, it's always good to be on like the cutting edge, right? Like you very rarely you get to do like new category creation, right? A lot of what I spent my time on was like looking at other protocols, seeing how it could be composed, or like seeing how you could merge through thematics, right? But I think like anyone who's or not anyone, but like most things that are really truly fascinating, either create an entirely new category or execute on something that was like previously impossible. A good example of the latter is like derivative backed stablecoins have not been a new concept by any means. Athena had a really good insight, right, with saying that you can get the reason this is like constrained is like you can't get enough liquidity on the short leg of the perp to go and do that on chain, right? So why don't we just go off chain, right, and do transparency reports and like boom, grows to a massive supply. And now they're have their chain vision, and I think that's always super interesting. But I think also finding ways to map crypto to other industries and use cases is always fascinating, right? Probably the area you see this the most is like DePIN. It's like how do we turn some of these physical infrastructure networks into like network settings, and that works to a certain extent. But the very interesting ones to me were always like, okay, are we in Filecoin or like going after storage, right? Um, or even like targeting other parts of the crypto stack and modularizing them, which I guess has been the main narrative in vogue. But when we looked at like sort of what was going on in AI, initially it was very much like a cryptographic exercise where you had people like Xerox Park being like, hey, in theory, like we can prove the integrity of like the run throughs for like AI models, right? But we were like, okay, that's interesting. We can see how that's important. But like really what's interesting is like crypto provides a good way to do incentive mechanisms for distribution of AI and like application and usage, right? It's a new mode of like monetizing open source software, right? Where it's like once you make some piece of software available, like on a chain, people can go build applications with that, right? Like that's the whole composability thesis, right? And then crypto also needs some level of censorship, or AI also needs some level of censorship resistance, right? Like ChatGPT or like OpenAI takes down apps from the ChatGPT store all the time. You can access it in like half the countries in the world. And like the only way you can really get access to models in those countries is like using open source models or like trying to like proxy through a VPN and use the like OpenAI API. And there's like a bunch of other sort of like interesting problems at the intersection. But it was like, okay, if you're gonna go create a new category, you might as well do it with like two of the software technologies that have seen the fastest adoption of like any technology probably ever, which are crypto and AI. And it also just like makes a lot of sense, right? Like if crypto is the promise that your data is owned, that it can be composed, that you can create governance around data primitives and you can create incentives around data primitives. And AI basically says you can take data and supercharge it and make it sentient. There is like a path in which those converge, right? And so to build a lot of the infrastructure that shares that, I think is what sort of led me to that, or led me back to that, and then eventually Ritual.
Yeah, the part that you discussed on kind of these two like worlds colliding of crypto and AI, I think being interested in that in 2020 was definitely early on. But I think even with the 4 years is a long time in any space, especially in crypto. I think honestly 99 or 97% of the people I talk to about like AI projects like BitTensor or any of the above have no idea what it is or how it works or like what it's actually doing. I think a lot of people are struggling to understand uh, the big picture, but not just like the 5 year vision, but the big picture in like practice. What is going to be possible on these in these ecosystems? You're starting to see like the understanding form a bit more, but I still think it's a bit lost. So I want to start there. Could you paint us that like big picture of, what is ritual? What do you want to
I think
accomplish?
that, and I'm sure this is my personal view on sort of like ritual, right? I'm sure everyone on the team has their own thing, right? I can tell you sort of like what ritual is, which I will, but I'll tell you like what the big picture and what it means to me is. I think that there should be some sort of structure, right, in which sort of you can access models globally wherever you are and build applications on top of them seamlessly, right? And the people who create those models and the people who build applications are rewarded for their contributions, right? And then you can do things to those models, right? You can do inference, you can do fine tuning, you can do whatever, right? And the idea is that anyone with any device anywhere should be able to access these models and not be constrained by going to one model provider. As we've seen, there's been like a lot of models, or going to like one site and have to worry that one day they may just lose their access, right? And that's really important for also building applications. Developers should be able to build applications in full confidence, knowing that they won't have their access to AI throttled. And the last bit of that is if you are providing a contribution to this network, there should be a reward for that. If you go and build an open source model right now, there's actually no reward mechanism that kicks back. If an application goes and builds on Llama or Mistral, they don't get anything for that. Like Meta and Mistral don't get anything for that, right? They get adoption, and I'm sure they have other plans on like how their end game, but they don't get anything for that. I think there's a way in which all of those are solved, and I think that the right infrastructure for that really is looks like a blockchain network, right? Because if you think about it, if you look at Ethereum, it's a shared state machine, right? It's essentially one big composable open backend as a gross oversimplification. But as a result, you can get everything from like the really crazy like hyper composable financial primitives to like a lot of like the renaissance we're seeing with like L2 and consumer applications built on top of that, and how those things port over. And I think that's interesting because you kind of have this like one shared like execution environment, right? That a lot of people can like go and interact with. And for Ritual, we want to do the same, but not just have the ability to do that, but also to access models, right? And so you have this one shared layer where you have a bunch of models and you can do things with those models, compose model calls, fine tune over those models, whatever it is, right? Access those models for inference. And people are aligned with that. And I think what that unlocks is like, it unlocks a lot of things on a lot of dimensions, right? Like if you're going to come and if you're, let's say, one of these like GPU networks or compute providers, right? You come to Ritual because there's going to be people there that want to run models over this network, right? Because the ability to access these models and pay for them are embedded, right? Um, and this is a good way to essentially funnel and increase utilization for the GPUs used on your network, as network participants for Ritual need to go and use compute, right? If you're an application developer, right, like what Ritual, what Infernet already does in sort of like an Oracle approach, and what Ritual Chain will do in a much more sort of enshrined approach, is you can just write smart contract function calls that like literally make calls for inference requests, right? And so you can literally write smart contracts over models and access to models, right? If you're someone who is building a lot of primitives around, let's say, verifiability, right? There should be a way in which you can offer those services to people if they care about verifying their model. And I think the only way to sort of like integrate all of that infrastructure, all of the things, or a large part of like the sort of like AI stack, crypto AI stack, is to have your own sort of sovereign execution layer and innovate at that layer. So maybe to circle back to, or to round this up, we want to basically be like this unifying infrastructure layer that sort of aggregates all of those, right? What that looks like in practice, we can go into, but um, you know, with Ritual, the end state should be that this is like the default place where anyone wants to host a model, anyone wants to build applications over models. This is like the best place to do it.
Could you walk through that one part on the
Mm-hmm.
smart contracts? Are you saying they're basically that AI infrastructure built in Ritual will be able to talk to other ecosystems over
Uh,
smart contracts, or is that all
Both,
inside of
right? The answer is
Ritual?
both. So, with
Both.
the reason I say both is because maybe on the part about talking to other ecosystems, twofold is like, one, we have a lot of really good like general like message passing layers, like GMP protocols that allow like chains to talk to each other now, right? Whether it's like the wormholes layer, zero axelars, whatever of the world, right? Like that already means that you have a good infrastructure for this, right? So if something happens on virtual chain, for example, someone kicks off a request to a model and they want to bridge that over, right, or like the data or the output over, right? There's infrastructure for this, right? Or you could just build it on virtual chain, and we aim for the chain to be EVM compatible. And two, we've already sort of like built this out, or not, we have built this out, right? Not necessarily with the chain vision, but the first phase of Ritual is Infernet, right? Which is sort of, you can think of it as an AI optimized Oracle network. You have a bunch of nodes that can run a variety of models off chain. And then we built an on chain SDK, or a set of contracts, right? That can communicate and like, make inference requests to these nodes, right? And they can put the outputs back on chain. And that's already something, that's being used by developers basically to bring, to make calls to AI models off chain and bring their outputs on chain, right? And that's a good way where it's like, okay, now through a smart contract, I can literally make an inference request, right? To some node that's running a chain off, to some node that's running a model off chain, and like do things with this, right? Whether it's like I have an agent that can like buy and sell for me, or like I'm calling out to a model that will like parameterize some part of my like DeFi protocol, right? A few people have built like really interesting agentic applications where you actually try and convince a model to like buy and sell your friend tech key, or like buy and sell your like NFT, right? Or let you mint an NFT. And like that's a really interesting thing that's like really pushing the bounds, where it's like a lot of the time hallucination of LLMs, or like their non-deterministic behavior is, treated as like a bug, but like really sometimes it can be a feature. Like you never know if the LLM is going to give the same, response to the same input, right? And that actually is kind of fun when you're like trying to get it to do like these more subjective like deals. So we already have people building that with the chain. We want to welcome developers to come and build natively on the chain and access that, but we also want to make sure that we offer these capabilities to developers in other ecosystems, right? So yeah.
Yeah. I would be interested to hear. I I know it's like obviously would be a lot of oversimplifying, and like the whole system, the whole stack is super complex, I think, for the average user. But I'd be interested to hear you take a stab at like if I'm a developer and I've built a smart contract that has a function call in it that requests some inference from Infernet, what happens in that
Mhm.
process? Like how do you get that computation from Infernet on chain, and like what are the assumptions throughout that process?
Yeah, good question. So right now, sort of like at a high level, basically you make something called a subscription to Infernet. For anyone that's used sort of like Oracle like Chainlink, the interface for that is like fairly similar, right? And the subscription will codify some sort of like input that you send, right? And then this gets logged in like a coordinator that keeps track of these. And the right node, and you can specify which node you want to pick this up, right? Or requirements around that can pick that up, right? And they'll ingest this input. They have the model running on their node, so how the node accesses the model, right? And how the node provides the compute for the model is up to them, right? And they generate the output, and then there's a standardized format for putting out the output on chain, right? And that's tracked back to the coordinator, and that's returned back to the user that called it out, right? So very, very simple to like basically, like I said, very, very analogous to any other Oracle, where it's like you make a request, the coordinator, has it, you specify maybe, if you want anyone to pick it up, great. If you want like a specific node set to pick it up, you can specify that, right? Node picks it up, gets the data for you, in this case, like the model output, and puts it back on chain. Now, we have baked in the ability to basically include arbitrary data for proofs, right? So if you want to pass in the right data for proof, for verification, for example, you can do that, right? But that's optional; it's not required, because some inference requests are like, a lot of people want to do like prompt to NFTs, right? So they like tell Stable Diffusion like, hey, generate this image, I want to make it an NFT. We actually have a flow built out for that, where it's like you pass in the input, node that has like Stable Diffusion, generates the image, uploads the image to Arweave, right? Keeps track of that metadata, right? And then creates an ERC 721, right, with a pointer to that metadata on chain, and then boom, like your image is an NFT, right? Um, so
What's the time on that? How fast?
it depends on like the actual node and sort of what hardware they're running. So like I think a lot of the constraint here is like the actual model run through, right? The actual transactions for like sending that, I mean, that's just like your regular expected time of conclusion of transaction. The time for that is not bounded because it's like highly depends on the model and what hardware they're running. So you can imagine that like if someone has like a really optimized setup, right, like their image gen will be like significantly faster. So like if you use there's a number of API providers, for example, that have like optimize their setup specifically for those models. But like, for example, if you're running a really small model, let's say like a linear regression model, right? Like very classical ML 101, that's going to run a lot faster than like running an LLM, right? A lot of the time. So
How many nodes are in this
question, I
network?
have to get the most recent count for you. We have like quite a number that joined when we like released it, that were like trying to do the prompt NFT or hello world. We wanted to make sure we patched an issue there on like them like rerunning the same computation. But I do know that in terms of inference requests done over Ritual, because Ritual also supports both on-chain and off-chain requests, right? And you can sort of like mix and match because sometimes you want the inputs passed off-chain, right? Because privacy reasons or whatnot, right? Um, uh, that is, we've probably done a few million in historical inference requests over the past few months. Yeah.
Are the nodes is running a node permissioned in any way? Is it
No,
like challenging to do? What are there like steep hardware requirements or
no, you
anything?
should be able to run it on like your laptop.
Oh,
Yeah,
sweet.
that's just a node.
That's
That's just a
awesome.
node. If you want to run the
Yeah, yeah.
model, you need to like, there's compute for running the
Different
model, but
story.
we make it as simple as possible to hook those up.
What are like some use cases that you're like currently aware of being built that kind of extend past like the proof of concept, past just like, minting an NFT or Hello World, something that like has practicality?
Yeah, so we have people that are building like agentic use cases. So the idea that like I should be able to tell a chatbot like, swap this, stake this, borrow this using this and this, right? And there should be a way where, I tell this LLM to do it. The LLM can actually take on-chain actions with permissions to a wallet, right? And like if I tell it swap, I don't know, like you know, 10 ETH for however many Bitcoin, right? Swap 10 ETH into Bitcoin, right? Like it should be able to go, go to Uniswap, or and I tell it swap 10 ETH for Bitcoin on Uniswap, or just find the smartest routing. It should be able to go and do that, right? In order to actually do that, it needs access to both. The model actually needs access to both the wallet, right, with the funds, but also the ability to actually go like make contract calls, right? So we can use Infernet, for example, to do that. Like I said, we have a number of people that have built sort of like agentic systems that like you try and convince and like communicate with an agent that like, hey, like I want, uh, you know, I want you to buy my friend tech key. This is why you should buy my friend tech key. The agent actually needs to one be able to like come to a decision on whether or not it wants to buy the friend tech key, and then two, if it does come to a decision that it does, and it actually needs to be able to take like the action that like, okay, I'm going to go and spend some ETH from that I have in my wallet and go and buy this person's key, right, or sell this other person's key. So things like that, where we see like a lot of like people really innovating at sort of the forefront of what does it look like to have agents both as counterparties in protocols, but also as representations of users, right? And adding them in both as like features, but also like sort of abstractions. And I think beyond that, there's quite a number of people that are now integrating or beginning to integrate that um, use like simpler models and like deeper architecture. So like taking a step outside of like LLMs or like Gen AI, which is largely like text and image. I think that we have a number of people that, for example, use much more simpler models for like doing appraisals for like assets or like price prediction, right? You can go build applications on top of that. Maybe you have like some sort of long tail or less liquid asset like an NFT or a watch, right? And you have a model that's like pretty decent at like appraising what the fair value of that is, and you need like a good price feed for what that is, maybe to go build a perps market or something like that, right? In order to go build a market based off that on chain, right, you need to be able to bring that feed on, right, at whatever regular interval, right? So you have this model running off chain. It tells you, based on some factors that it ingests, like this is, what the fair appraisal for this asset is. And I put it out on chain. Now it's like, okay, maybe someone uses that, appraisal to construct like a loan against it, right? And monitor like a loan health or construct a perp market off it, things like that.
Can you like add color to that, like the like more agentic use cases? So like right now, obviously, there are cases out there, there will be, where I can go and I can try and convince an agent to purchase my NFT or my meme coin or whatever. And then in the longer run, that like those parties can serve as like counterparties or stakeholders on DeFi protocols. Um, what is that like? How does that like flesh out in the longer run? Like, what would these actors like be in DeFi and in crypto in like a more like realized state?
Yeah, good question. I think that in the next 5 to 10 years, there's a good chance we have more, bot or like AI transactions doing like real activity, not just like farming civils or whatever, right? Doing civil farming, transacting than like actual humans, right? So like in an end state, right? I think that crypto does have a lot of user complexity. We've made a lot of massive strides in in bridging that gap. But one really interesting thing I think that comes with the advent of AI that crypto provides is, you know, all of these sort of behavior, the financial behavior, for example, we see on chain or on chain interaction behavior is in a very like programmatic environment. In other words, it's in an environment that's a little bit more easier to understand, right? For like something like an LLM, than potentially an LLM going around and like clicking buttons on a bunch of sites for you and like more traditional infrastructure. So what this means is that I think in an end state, you have a number of players where agents are. So there's going to be continue to be, I think, services and applications where you tell an agent what you to do, or you tell an agent you want it to behave a certain way, like and it goes and executes on chain for you, and like you don't actually have to click a bunch of buttons. You just tell it in natural language. That'll be one, and that'll be like agents as representations of users. I do think that like a lot of protocols, especially as they move to DAOs, right? Like there's this whole governance overhead, right? And like some of them, do a good job, and they, hire services like, Chaos Labs or Gauntlet or something like that, for example, to come to fair sort of like, or to do analysis and basically set, the parameters at whatever cadence, right? They do these reports for like, let's say a DeFi protocol for like, what the LTVs should be for certain pools, right? I do think it's very feasible that in the future that gets even more automated, where you have an agent that has access to maybe to, other models, right? That are good at evaluating that, and the agent itself is given permission to autonomously update certain parameters of like the protocol. So instead of like having this like human governance overhead, right, and all the drama that comes with it, you essentially have this agent that acts in the loop and acts in the protocol, or goes inserts itself in the protocol loop, and circumvents the governance overhead to provide updates to mission critical features. So both from like the user side, right, and from the protocol side in terms of like monitoring, updating parameters, etc. I think it'll be interesting. And then the last point I mentioned is like, I think people will want to build products around these models and agents, right? And it's like if you view these as like, human-like intelligence, right? Like, in the fintech case or like in the NFT case, right? Like just the way you might like go and DM someone on Twitter and like try and bargain with them. It's like, hey, dude, I saw that this is like your ask for like an NFT. Like, can you get it lower? Like you try and go bargain with the agent, right? And so to an extent, that's maybe a representation of like humans, right? But in a different sense where it's like it acts as your counterparty on your behalf, without sort of like active instruction, right? And I think that will be potentially one of the most interesting sort of applications to see being built, because um, uh, that's I think a space that's been like quite underexplored so far. I think the other two of like having natural language interfaces for interacting on chain, and then now people are exploring maybe what it looks like a little bit to have like agents be in the loop in terms of like designating certain protocol parameters, etc. That's stuff that's being explored, but building applications around the models as opposed to injecting them in your models, I think if that makes sense, will be very interesting, and I think people are starting to hopefully realize that that's also an interesting design space.
Mm. Yeah, I think the natural language interface stuff has been like talked about for a while, I think, and then when you combine that with like the agents acting on your behalf to accomplish some sort of return or some sort of financial outcome, that's I think it's starting to gain like more traction. We've had a couple people talk about it on here. I think when it comes to when it comes to any like innovative technology, I always find it fun to like get ahead of myself and like really look like far, like try and like make a couple of assumptions and really like jump ahead and see what things would look like. And we had Oak Sprout from Autonomous on a while ago, 2-3 months ago. And he was really big on the idea of like agents acting as like essentially like financial advisors or financial actors for people on chain. So, you're just looking for the best risk adjusted returns, and your agent or your network of agents goes to do it. And I remember what I asked him was like, as this stuff progresses, like if everybody's agent is the best at what it does, then like is anyone's, like who's really winning in that case if nobody's losing? Um and like, obviously it's a difficult question to answer, but it is like a fun like kind of doomerish thing. What are some like do you ever get like doomerish about this stuff and start to think about like the repercussions of your actions type stuff? And if so, like in what way?
Maybe I think
Not
one really
necessarily, yeah.
interesting that like Ritual enables is like it is a at the end of the day, it's like an open network, right? And anyone can go and access and like put things on. We don't have any control, over that stuff, right? So like theoretically, if someone to go run a node and make it available for something that's like, you know, uh, a model that tells you to do not so savory stuff, right? For example, um, that's not something we can control because it's built as open permissionless infrastructure, right? So maybe there's a world in which like, I'm slightly worried about that. But then again, right? Like that's not something that we have control of for any network or any builder really has control of, right? In terms of like permissioning what comes on the network. And the moment you do that, then like you are fully responsible for everything that comes on, right? And so, you know, there's definitely been some interesting like I guess like chatbots and stuff like people have put together that like are less savory than maybe your chat GPTs of the world. Do I worry about it or like do I get doomerish about it? Uh, Not really. I think that innovations come from like really weird places, and at the end of the day, like there when you're building sort of like open permissionless infrastructure, you have to take the good with the bad. So the same forcing functions or the same incentive functions that will want people to come and like put the best models on this network, right? Like maybe in like the OS case, like the best financial models on this network, right, are also going to be the ones that incentivize people to come and like make their models available for distribution. On the like agent case or like the financial agent case, I think it's interesting. Like if every agent is like theoretically like the best at um, what it does, like maybe they'll all converge to the same strategies, or maybe it'll just be a continuous race to like develop a better agent to act on your behalf, right? I think both are interesting, right? You either get to a terminal state where like you have a bunch, you finally like hit the economist's wet dream, and you have a bunch of completely rational actors in the market, right? And you that's like really good for maybe like protocol design because now if you assume that you have like these perfectly rational agents acting on everyone's behalf, maybe a lot of like these protocol design things in theory that are like purely theoretical will hold true, right? Or you basically have a continuous incentive to like go and create better and better agents, right? For specific use cases, which also isn't necessarily bad. So I don't think it's very doomer. I know there's quite a lot of people in like the AGI is like doomer camp, but you know regardless of like where it heads us, like you do need to innovate, and there's like massive benefits, not just to crypto but overall to innovating. And if you can create good infrastructure that allows that process to be both democratized but as incentive aligned as possible, then I think the overall good outweighs the bad.
Yeah, couple of
Yeah, I think the
go ahead, Cedo.
good, good.
Yeah,
The
you got it.
not used to the remote podcast
Too
anymore.
many in
The
persons.
yeah, what the whole doomer thing just like kind of brought to my head the war of like, I guess somewhat war of like open source versus like closed source. Um, you guys, you mentioned a lot the kind of goal to embody like access to a lot of these really good open source models that may live in other places. Um, how do you observe that kind of like open source versus closed source like world? The way that you're describing these bots, it would also seem very beneficial to even closed source models to have access to this infrastructure. I mean, like, where else can these bots play around with, internet money, except through here? So, how are you thinking about that war between open source and closed source models, and how they're going to end up
I
living
don't think it's
in
our
each world?
place to decide. If the question is like, do we only support open source or closed source models? The answer is we support both. We have nodes that make calls to closed source models, whether it's their own or someone's external, and we have nodes that are taking open source models from Hugging Face and running them. And I think, like I said, like when you are building, credibly neutral infrastructure, right, to allow for basically open model access and create an ecosystem around that, that really should be open model access, right? Like it's not like okay, maybe it's ethos aligned if you say like we're in crypto, so we should be like supporting only open source models, right? But then that's inherently like hypocritical, right? That you're blocking off access to a very like good corpus of like closed source models, right? I mean, like what ChatGPT unveiled recently is quite impressive in terms of multimodality, right? Um, and so for us, I don't think it's like okay, we pick a side in the war of like will open source models or closed source models win. I think there's really, really fascinating developments in both ecosystems. It's more like, how do we create infrastructure that allows anyone to access either side wherever they are, right, and build applications wherever they are. So that's sort of like the impetus there, where it's like we want to create, access to these models. So
Yeah, I think
Was there anything? Sorry, last one. Was there anything cool that you saw? You mentioned the ChatGPT like unveil. Was there anything that maybe like you know the regular folk didn't notice that you noticed in those
yeah, I
presentations?
think there's just a lot of really, really cool applications and like things that you can build when you use system prompting. Like there was a thread today that went kind of viral where someone like got it to create like a terminal based emulator for like Pokemon Red with like a single system prompt, because it can do like multimodal, right? Um, because it's multimodal tokens, you can like literally tell it like talk faster and text to speech function, right? It seems like their neural translation has like worked really well, and that's like been a like its own area of like AI ML research for a very long time in terms of machine translation, like how do I go from a language to another, and the fact that they bake that into a model that can do like image, text speech, just regular text, and that is quite impressive. But I think like it's very early to see sort of like how people are going to like jerry rigged and like prompt hack this essentially to get it to do different things. But even the fact that it can create like a game emulator, I think is like pretty wild, right? With just like a system level prompt. So um, I don't know if there's a lot of this is being like highlighted on Twitter. I don't know if there's like any like crazy like deep insight I have from that takeaway, but yeah.
these days, like every OpenAI announcement or new big thing kind of takes over for a couple days with all the marginal or big improvements as they might be. I want to shift back over to like the crypto side of things for a second. Um, there's a couple of different like problems with AI, or centralized AI that you guys talk about on your website and your blogs. I think like centralized and permissioned access to APIs, opaqueness, so not being able to verify the integrity of compute or inputs and outputs, uh, hardware costs, obviously, and then a lack of proper incentive alignment, which I think is like, at least in my opinion, the most interesting one for the intersection of the two fields. I don't know too much about how Ritual plans to incentivize the different actors within its infrastructure. I don't know if that stuff is like laid out already, but can you speak to that a little bit? If there's nothing like set in stone, I'd love to hear like how you guys are kind of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think on that point, it's like very much you know uh, a work in progress, and we have like the Ritual Foundation, right? Who really sort of like considers itself for us, right? With like Ritual, what we do and what the team does is like we're very much focused on building out like the tech and building like the rails for these things to actually enact, but sort of like the roadmap and stuff like that, like that's sort of something we want the foundation and the community to sort of like spearhead. Um, so yeah, a lot of that's work in progress. We have some like interesting research at like the infrastructure level, for example, on like, for example, um, you know, how do I make sure, you know, with some sense of like evaluation of like how much I value my query, like it gets routed to like the right, end node or like end model provider in the ecosystem, right? Um, but that's still, like I said, a lot of that's very much a work in progress. Some of the all of the incentive stuff, I think, is under the purview of the foundation.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. What about like development wise, like for the rest? And I realize like, it's kind of a moving target. Everybody's kind of building the plane as they're flying it. But as of right now for 2024, what are you guys kind of like most focused on at Ritual?
Yeah. So like, in the same vein of like we want to give tech to people, like we are a tech builder. Like with Infernet, it's already maybe like a good half step of like here is a way to go and access model outputs on chain. I think that's like pretty simple, right? When you have an output space on chain, that can mean anything from like literally bringing some data that a model generates on chain to having the model take actions on chain, right, and make function calls. But I think when I say with the ritual chain, like people are going to be able to write smart contracts directly over models. There won't be like this whole two-step like call out flow. Like you will literally have a function, right, where you specify like, okay, this is my input, this is the model I want to hit, and you send that transaction, and then it executes along with the model being queried, right? that'll be like a really, really powerful experience, right? In the same way that like, if this was Web2 land, like all of these DeFi protocols would have, their own APIs, right? And then like some developer would have to like go jerry rig like all of these APIs, and like maybe there can be like an extent that like or their own REST APIs, right? And you would have to go jerry rig it. And maybe there's like an argument that like the modes for interacting with these systems on chain is like you already have to go respect like the interfaces of like their smart contracts, right? Um, but with Ethereum, at least, like I can just write a smart contract that makes like calls to like these different protocols, right? If I want to like literally in the same contract, like buy some asset from Uniswap using ETH, right? Put that in in a lending pool, and then borrow more, and just do that recursively, right? And like people have done it, right? That's like a good example of like how people have been able to leverage composability, right, with just basic smart contracts, right, in Ethereum. I think the same thing where it's like if I want to query like a model, right, get the output and have that call like another model, right, depending on what the output is, right, and then use that model output to control some action, right, more inform the original model. There should be a way in which I can like cleanly like just make function calls and chain those, right. And I think that's something that Rich will enable in sort of like a smart contract setting. Yeah, and so to answer your question of like what we're excited about, uh, we want to get like the DevNet and test it, or we want to give a product to people that lets them use it and try that and test that as soon as possible.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. I just realized um we had talked about this like before the episode. We never really touched base on like the Ritual team. I know you mentioned that you guys had all like built something together in the past, or just like the story of how you guys came together. Can you speak a little bit of like the founding team and how you guys ended up building Ritual?
Yeah. So Auction Raj are the co-founders. I'm on the founding team with like Anish, Eva, and a few others. Akash and Raj were partners at Polychain. Anish and I were fortunate enough to be interns at Polychain. Anish later stayed on a little bit longer than I did. So really, the first three people, for example, I worked with was Niraj, who we sort of met and brought us in, and Akash we worked with when we were there along with Niraj. Um, and Eva was a friend that was sort of like in the same circle, is doing very much ML focused, but like getting into crypto, and I met Akash that way. So we had this, friendship and bond, I think that had gone back, I guess now 3 or 4 years ago, right? 3.5 years, 4 years ago to Polychain, where we had like, research protocols together, built infrastructure together, right? Things like that. And so we had been fortunate, even though like we all went sort of like different ways, like after Polychain, right? Like, Anish went to Paradigm, I went to go, invest and then go build protocols and stuff like that, to still be in touch, right? And hang out over the years, right? Um, and Akash in particular had a deep background in ML before coming over to crypto. So I think he was one of the first of us to start looking into this space. And then Niraj had always been very like keen, or had a good keen eye for how do you give developers new tools in crypto ecosystems, and like enhance the infrastructure that they can build with. And so I think at the same time they sort of like converge on like, oh, there's something to be built here, in terms of allowing developers in crypto to access AI models, right? And vice versa, allow people that want to like use AI models into applications to build them as like crypto applications. So I think when they were sort of ideating, and they came upon the idea of Ritual. We had also been sort of like you know talking with them like loosely, not necessarily about Ritual, but about the space broadly. So when they went and started Ritual, and they approached a number of us, it was sort of like a no brainer, because like one, it was the boys and girls, right? It was like just all the homies to that wanted to come build this thing. And two, I think there was like a lot of alignment, and that like this was a really exciting space in general. Like a really good place to be in crypto is always to um, build or give developers in crypto access to new tooling, and just let them go ham and see what they can create. And a lot of us were actually generally passionate about what was being built, so and a lot of the problems that would come in building something like the Ritual chain. So that's sort of like how it came together. And then we were like very fortunate to continue to hire some amazing, like far smarter people than I to help across the organization with engineering. So like, you know, there's a number of developers and researchers that also used to work at Polychain a little bit after me, but with Aklesh and Anish, I was fortunate to bring over to Celia to help with BD, who I used to work with on the investment team at Dragonfly, things like that. And then since then, we've also, very much like opened up, and we've, met amazing people that, weren't necessarily in network before, that have come to work with us on things from core research to engineering to ops, right? But yeah, that's really how it got started. I would say it was just a lot of a group of friends who was interested in the space that sort of had the same sort of first principles high level thinking, and Akash and Raj brought us together. So
I'm curious to hear. I don't see many teams who have like such a heavy like venture background. I feel like that's definitely like a notable trait. Um, and I mean, obviously, there's some firms that are like a little bit more known for that. Guys like Paradigm are always messing around in DeFi, but in general, like I feel like usually what I see is like the opposite. Teams going or people going um, start some sort of venture, end up exiting or end up having success or failure or whatever, and then they move on to venture capital afterwards. But in this case, it seems like it was like kind of sandwiched, or like maybe the other way around. How do you how do you find that to be like useful, having a team that is like so heavily into the or was so
Mhm.
heavily into the investment space prior?
Good question. I think that you know when you're a venture investor, you get okay. It's a really interesting phenomenon, right? You'll never be as deep in the weeds as a builder, not even like close, right? Like if you're building a protocol, you have to know sort of like everything about your space, right? The infrastructure, who you're targeting, etc., right? But being a venture investor is really interesting because what you maybe trade off for in depth, right? You get to trade in for like breadth of learning, is how I would say it, right? So like your job as an investor is to, do things threefold. It's like, you want to go win, good deals, which means, knowing people and being able to talk to a lot of people, and then being well read and well researched on the, areas that you're interested or you're looking to invest in, right? Which means that you get a really, really quick, like rapid look at companies across different sectors, and different stages, and like what works and what doesn't for them, right? When you have access to that information flow, you can go say like, oh, this strategy worked for like this company when they were trying to grow their community, or like this is how this company did developer adoption, right? Or grew their ecosystem, whatever it is, right? And I think that's really, really useful, right? Where not only does having like the network come and help, but having that pattern recognition, or having those maybe like comparable stories or analogies, right, to inform your own decision making approach. So no two companies ever the same, and like history doesn't like rhyme, but it repeats. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, I think, is like the saying, right? And having more information is always good, right? So maybe you'll find yourself, in terms of making a decision on like, how do I grow the ecosystem, right? Or how do I prioritize what kind of products I want to build at the infra layer, and having maybe like a more of like an inside view of like what the decision making looked like at companies of teams before you. I think really, really, really helps. It just gives you a lot of sort of like comparable information, right? So maybe like to give an example, right? Like I think Monad is like in all the vogue right now, right? But I think and so is Chain. But I think like for the longest time they weren't maybe in like the mainstream attention, right? And unless you were actually like members of this like community and you were like engaging, right, you probably wouldn't have been there since the inception. But seeing that early on and seeing those deals early on, and like talking to folks at their team to understand how they thought about it like structurally, right, gives you a really good sense for how like protocols can build world class communities, right? And it, sometimes, there is like a certain element of like randomness and luck to that, but there's also like a certain element of like systematic and strategic thinking, right? That like they're not writing about, not because they don't want to be transparent around how they build this. I mean, obviously, if you can go join the community and see like all the things they're doing, right? But because like they're too busy doing other things. But I think it gives you a good network of people to sort of like get those comparables, and good pattern recognition essentially. But I will say that um, still nothing prepares you for like being a builder, especially at the scale, right? It's helpful, but it's still its own beast. They're both very different. They're similar, but they're still very, very different roles. But I think there is some applicable lessons.
Yeah. Yeah, I always find it interesting because it always goes, it always kind of flows one way. To see it go the other way is interesting to hear like how that's kind of applicable. We're coming up on time here. Got about a minute left. I just wanted to give you a second, Sunil, in case there was anything you wanted to share with the people, anything we might have missed that they should know about you or about Ritual. Any kind of like closing remarks, we'd love to hear them.
Well, not about me, but about Ritual. I mean, Infernet's live. Go try that. Like, if you're a developer or you just want to go build an application and you want to see how it can do, go try it. If you have any questions, DM me or literally anyone of the team that the Ritual account follows, and like we will help or hop in our Discord. Um, and I think that'll be a really good, about like really good seg into sort of like what it looks like to actually build like AI enabled apps on chain, and what it'll feel like to build on like the Ritual chain. And then I think I always like leave people with this when I do that is like crypto is a great industry as a forcing function for innovation. There's a lot of phenomenal builders and investors here, right? There's also like a lot of noise. So with everything, like even me, like don't take everything like for granted just because like it comes from someone that is perceived. Like go and do your own research, right? Go and like learn things, whether it's in AI and crypto or whatever. Go actually do your best to verify if certain claims by teams are real or not, right? I think that the worst thing we can do for our industry is always to burn our reputations out on promising too much, and maybe reaping the rewards from things that people really shouldn't be. And the only way to sort of counteract that is to have sort of like you know good first principles thinking around what's interesting and what you want to spend your time on as a user, right? Um, so yeah, that's my two things. Go try Ritual, join our Discord, follow our Twitter.
Cool. That's episode 72, I think. I'm not
Three,
confident in that at all.
73, 73.
Something like that. Yeah, thanks again, Saneel. This was great. Really appreciate you
Yeah,
coming on.
thanks for having me, guys.